Okay, so this session follows on from the last, and you'll recall last week we looked at the Acts of the Apostles, and in comparing these two texts, or looking at these two texts side by side, the Acts of the Apostles last week, and this week the Book of Revelation, or Apocalypse, the Apocalypse of St. John, as it's also known, they have two quite contrasting approaches to the Roman Empire. And this is a tension and a conflict which pervades the New Testament, and we've kind of seen its development through the various texts that we've looked at. You'll remember the earliest texts in the New Testament, the letters of Paul, deeply immersed within an apocalyptic kind of worldview, where the end of the world is at hand, but that apocalyptic worldview always went hand in hand with opposition to real existing ruling powers. It was the transition from this age, which is ruled by the current holders of power, and in the case of the first century, the Roman Empire, to the age to come, which would be ruled by and or in line with the values of the Jewish God. Acts took a kind of ambivalent mediating position, and I suppose a large part of the reason for that is that by the time Acts was written, whether the majority view towards the end of the first century or perhaps into the early second, the church was starting to get more and more adherence within, slightly higher, or more complex social positions within Roman society. This was already evident much earlier on, decades earlier on, but by this point in time, you have a predominantly non-Jewish Christians, and different views were beginning to take shape. Ones that were more, I guess, amenable to Christianity being to persist into the future. If Christianity had stayed as kind of oppositional and as anti-imperial as it was initially, everyone probably would have died out, and it wouldn't have been able to sustain itself into subsequent generations. We'll return to some of these questions next week when we look at the pastoral epistles and we start to see the church itself develop more formal structures and institutions, becoming an institution as a way to become something that can be sustainable, over the long term. But today we focus on the Book of Revelation. And I think it's important to note that there are texts within the New Testament, many texts within the New Testament, that are vehemently opposed to the world, or the world ruled by Rome. And this constant conflict or tension between kind of oppositional texts and conformist texts, which often go side by side, I think explains a lot about the development of Christianity through its long and complex history. Today, how do you find people reading the same books of the Bible, the same material, and coming to very different political or theological views, and both finding justification for those particular views? Well, this complexity, this tension between kind of revolution and reaction is definitely a factor there.
There are two separate issues that are up there, as I see it. There's opposition to Rome, and the end of the world is at hand. And they need necessarily be one and the same. I mean, as you were describing last week, there was this strand of thought that yes, the world will come to an end, and Rome will be kicked out. But they're two separate issues, aren't they? I mean, there's always been this apocalyptic genre in human thought, isn't there? I mean, the 2000
So
bug,
one of the things we're going to look at, and I hope this will answer your question, because I think that actually they do go hand in hand within Jewish apocalyptic thought. So if we're talking about, so you're right in the sense that apocalypticism might be something that's cross-cultural. It doesn't always go hand in hand with opposition to ruling powers. In the case of Jewish apocalyptic thought, absolutely, it always went hand in hand. So I'm trying to think if there's some examples that didn't, but no, the whole message of apocalypticism was the world is at ruin because it's not currently ruled in line with the Jewish God. And so God's going to radically intervene to bring about the end of this age and bring in a new one. So there was always something within that tradition, at least theopolitical, about it. Interestingly, though, Jewish apocalyptic and Christian apocalyptic then over its history, over Christian history, or over the past 2,000 years, has inspired a number of apocalyptic movements which don't have those sorts of political ideas intrinsically attached to them. Okay. Well, I've started. My first slide poses this question: the most misinterpreted book of the New Testament. I think that the book of Revelation, note that it's not called Revelations, it's in the singular. Also known as the Apocalypse, which is simply another translation of the word, a more liberal translation of the word apocalypsis, which means disclosure, unveiling, revelation, brings the canon of the New Testament to a close with visions of the consummation of God's plan of judgment and salvation. The book is usually dated towards the end of the first century, and it's attributed to an individual named John, who is not thought to be the same John that tradition has attributed to the Gospel of John or the letters of John. It's thought to be a different John, at least according to tradition. And Revelation is, as I indicated, perhaps the most misunderstood and misinterpreted book of the New Testament. And this, I think, partly stems from the fact that its form, its genre, has very little in common with modern literary genres, like narratives or letters. And if we're but if we are to interpret it in a similar way or in the same kind of way that we've been looking at the other texts of the New Testament according to their literary form or genre, with the Gospels, letters, and so on, then we need to understand the specifics, the peculiarities of this style of writing. The genre, which is, and it takes its name from this book, so scholars have named the genre, modern scholars have named the genre after this book as Jewish apocalyptic. And there were and are, in fact, many apocalyptic texts that we have. Not so many in the Bible, although the book of Daniel is one comparative example. And we do see hints of apocalyptic style thought through the other books of the New Testament, as we've seen, particularly like the Gospel of Mark and the letters of Paul. If we were to compare the genre of Jewish apocalyptic to modern forms of literature or art, we might use the following examples. It might be like a comic book narrating an epic struggle between the forces of good and evil. Or it could be a sort of vast painting with lots of little detail that you can look in and look at the small details and interpret them. Or perhaps even a work of modern art where the meaning isn't quite easily, so decipherable to begin with. How then are we to interpret this book? It's certainly been a happy hunting ground for many interpreters with idiosyncratic ideas. And I think this comes through most strongly in quite a dominant approach to Revelation. And it's the approach that I'm going to label futurist interpretations. It's the approach that seems to come through popular culture. It's promoted by certain, I guess, fundamentalist and some evangelical modern day movements or churches. It reads the book of Revelation as a blueprint for the end times. It suggests that the book of Revelation refers to today or sometime in our own future, or the future of human history yet to be realized. While this is a somewhat popular and dominant approach within contemporary culture, it's somewhat ignorant of the genre of Jewish apocalyptic. It's not the way in which scholars of the New Testament would read this text. In this class, we've been pursuing a historical approach, trying to understand the texts within their ancient historical context. And the one thing to note is that there's not just one way of reading the Bible. There are multiple ways of approaching it. And the approach that I choose within this class and so on is the kind of approach that you would get in a university classroom, where you would study texts by putting them in, as you would study any ancient texts or texts from any culture, by putting them within their historical, cultural, so on framework, and trying to understand them on their own terms within that context. And I think there are some convincing reasons for why we should approach Revelation in that way and not in the futurist way, and they come from the text itself. If we open to the book of Revelation, the text itself is addressed to specific churches in John's own day. So we see right from 1:4 where the author introduces himself and then says, John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia. And then through the first 3 chapters of Revelation, he addresses these specific churches in detail, oftentimes kind of berating them for, their unfaithfulness or something that they've done wrong, their lack of allegiance to Christ or something like that, or sometimes words of encouragement. But interestingly, similarly to the letters of Paul, the author, even though he's writing in the style of apocalyptic, is addressing his concerns to specific contextual situational situations. But also there is a strong sense in the text that John was speaking to his own time and place, not writing a guide to events 2,000 years in the future. I've got some references up there, but he repeatedly says that these things will come to fulfillment soon, and the end time is near. So there is a sense of immediacy, and if we're to date John within the late 1st century, it would be very peculiar for him to use that language, but intend to mean 2,000 years' time. Okay, now's a good point to just pause and see if anybody had any comments or points to make about this. It always depends on who I've got in the classrooms. For some for some students, depending on your kind of church background, this will be like, well, yeah, of course. Whereas for others, you know, the futurist, so-called futurist interpretation might be the only one you've ever heard of, or you know, you're not sure what to do with it or whatever. So I'm interested in what your own previous, you know, familiarity with this text has been.
I was wondering whether futurist is a parallel with spiritual interpretation, or whether that the spirituality of the revelation is a separate way of looking at it.
Yeah, I would probably make that a separate category, because I think there is a way, and I kind of alluded to this, but I can spell it out a bit more. I think there is a way of engaging the Book of Revelation kind of more on a spiritual level than the way that we haven't really been engaging in this class, and a way that might be informed to a certain extent by the historical approach. But it's the futurist interpretations. What I mean is that kind of dominant popular cultural view that that Revelation is writing about, you know, end times today or tomorrow, or you know, that has featured as the inspiration for countless movies and references and cults through history and also in the modern era.
You talk about links with modern literature, or you alluded to it. The picture that comes into my mind is J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which is, when I read it at 15, it blew my mind, sort of thing.
Yeah, and obviously, you know, Tolkien was himself inspired by, you know, intentionally by biblical literature. But yeah, there is that sense of epic narrative and the forces of good and evil.
Where beasts, colour, dragons.
Yeah.
On the one side, good, on the other side.
Yeah. A kind of a mythological battle of
good, gloom and
yeah. It's actually I haven't made that connection before, but I think it is an interesting comparison.
I think that was one of my other questions too, in terms of all the mythological, the symbolism of things. I don't understand, because they're not in my, they're no longer a frame of reference for me.
Yeah.
But I think to really understand it, we almost need, once again, another category. The symbolism, and what the symbolism meant to the people at that time.
Well, I think, as we'll see, that's where we'll get to with the historical approach. It'll have, because we're putting it in the context. It's like when you have these references to these symbols, how would a first century person, in particular first century Jew, have understood these symbols?
Especially if everything was relayed to them orally rather than reading it themselves. My coach was well and truly rattled by reading Revelation and then reading afterwards, because I just found it very hard to get my head around anything. You know, why don't they say what they mean instead of wrapping it all up in symbolism?
Yeah.
Particularly when, you know, there's the reference to the same thing being said over and over again in different ways. I wasn't picking that up at all, because I don't think any of it went into my head.
Yeah, and we're just not trained or accustomed to reading it. And it would be like, an example might be someone who's never read a newspaper before, reading a newspaper and not quite understanding how it relates to anything.
That's right.
They might just think they're reading a piece of fiction or something, or the reverse. Well, that's right. Well, and that's the other thing, is that, you know, then comes the media literacy, where we don't simply just trust everything because we know that authors, even journalists, especially journalists, have an agenda and so on.
To me, it's read like someone that John had ate a bad mushroom or something. To me, you know, I just could imagine this being filmed in a way.
Being drug-induced hallucinatory experience.
Yes, that to me, like some Yeah, hallucinogenic experience
Yeah.
to me that with all these.
Well, I
things coming
mean,
at
he
me.
literally is telling it as a dream. isn't he?
Yes, and the
Retelling a crazy
locusts.
dream that
With, you know, with lions head and.
Yeah.
Are
Yeah.
there any funny herbs that
Yes.
No, there's a long discredited theory that was written by a scholar called John Allegro. It was published in the 1970s. Called
magic?
yeah, the sacred mushroom cult or something. Early Christianity, the sacred mushroom cult or something like that. And he was a very reputable scholar who had published some of the Dead Sea Scrolls and had an illustrious career. And then he published this book where he suggested that early Christians, like Jesus didn't exist, and the early Christians were actually worshipping a mushroom, and or the hallucinogenic experience of a mushroom. It was this mushroom common. But yeah, so it's not as if these ideas haven't been explored before.
To return to your first question,
Yeah.
One clergyman of my acquaintance, who was of the sort of high church Catholic party, said the way to deal with this book is to just sit back and let it wash over you. And the other instance that comes into mind with a chap by the name of Paisley, who had a very strong North of Ireland accent, who saw the whole history of Northern Ireland in particular and the world in general through the book of Revelation. He was weird in many ways.
I think there is quite a tendency for people to think that what they're reading relates to our times, and in the reading there was
in a
third,
specific sense.
there was a third category idealist, which to me sounded as though it was a little bit into the future, but not as far into the future as we are.
Yeah. These are my categories, by the way. They're not ones that that are taken from the readings. Okay, I mean, it's an interesting conversation. I think that next week we're going to be talking a bit more about ideas of canonization and the developing of the New Testament itself, the formation of the New Testament itself. The Book of Revelation has always had a contentious place within the canon. Martin Luther, for example, didn't want it in the canon. And it's been seen as a problematic text time and again. All right, so let's turn to what we know about the genre. So as I mentioned, there were a number of what we might call Jewish apocalyptic texts around and prior to the 1st century. And I should, I want to just make the distinction between apocalypticism or Jewish apocalypticism as a worldview,
As a what, sorry?
as a worldview, which I've talked a lot about. I don't think I have the slides here, no, but you'll remember, or I hope you remember, those diagrams I had concerning Paul's view of the present age, and then there was an arrow, and the age to come. If you're lost, when you revisit this, you might go back and look at the slides from a couple of weeks ago. But what this was reflective of was this apocalyptic worldview. So Paul and many other 1st century Jews inhabited this view of the world, which was divided up into the different ages and so on and so forth. Apocalyptic literature refers to texts that predominantly embody this view, but in a kind of textualized form. So I just want to make that distinction, because we can talk about apocalypticism without necessarily talking about explicit apocalyptic texts or literature like the Book of Revelation or Daniel. as we have been doing through this class.
Was that from political pressure within the Jewish?
Right. Well,
society?
apocalyptic literature evokes an imaginative world that is set in deliberate counterpoint to the world of the present. And so it often emerged at times of intense crisis, or the perception of crisis, perhaps persecution, or a view that, and an experience that the world was not working in the way that it should, and the reason for the world not working in the way that it should was because evil demonic forces that were opposed to God were controlling the world. Apocalypticism as a worldview saw or understood the material world, the human world, society, politics, and so on, to be reflecting and, I guess, guided by overarching cosmic forces. So one way of thinking about it is that the power that gave Rome its power and its might were demonic forces. There wasn't this easy distinction between the kind of the secular and the spiritual or anything like this. They went hand in hand. In a sense, apocalypticism and thriving in times of crisis, it functions by offering a resolution to the crisis in the future. It says, okay, things might be bad now in the present, but we know that God is ultimately all-powerful and all-loving and so on, and will bring about a resolution to this current crisis, and often quite violent and apocalyptic ways. But ultimately, there is that message of, through what might entail quite a lot of destruction and bloodshed, will come God's glory, and there is a sort of message of hope peeking through. Of course, and I think the Book of Revelation is a good example of this. It's not all going to be fine and dandy tomorrow when you wake up. Things might get a lot worse before they get better. And so the apocalyptic texts in particular, as well as offering a kind of condemnation on society as it is, also and providing a glimmer of hope into the future, there's also a sense of wanting to explain the evils in the world and explain why the things that are happening, and explain them in terms of appeal to these cosmic battles happening in heaven or in the heavens, but also to offer encouragement and to encourage those within situations of despair and so on to keep the faith, as it were, to stay allegiant, and to not give up hope, even if things get a lot worse. I think in many respects, apocalyptic literature is difficult for many of us to relate to, especially in the sort of the affluent so-called Western world. Whereas I think that these sorts of messages might resonate a lot more strongly with other readers elsewhere. I don't think we're necessarily, most of us would be the prime audience for that sort of message. And I think terrible things can happen if we were to think that those sorts of messages apply to us. There is sometimes the futurist approach to Revelation will almost be looking for, searching, the contemporary events in, say, Australian society, looking for, I don't know, persecution of Christians or something like that, and really overblow it's not that persecution of Christians doesn't happen in some parts of the world, absolutely it does, but you know, I've seen it happen where it's sort of overblown, as if we don't have you know, Pentecostal prime minister in Australia, and actually Christianity has a pretty privileged place still, even if it doesn't have the place it once enjoyed. So, you know, we have to be careful with these themes and what we do with them.
Would you say that the Quran was apocalyptic?
Not Jewish apocalyptic.
No.
I don't think I know enough about the Quran to answer that question.
I suspect it may be, which would perhaps be why it appeals to the Arab street.
All right. So what are, okay. A few more minutes. Yes. So here are some more aspects of apocalyptic. Some of these ideas I've mentioned, but they're kind of, you know, written on the slide in a bit more eloquent form. So apocalyptic shares this religious attitude to history. So history, great political events and so on, are not simply kind of secular accidents of history, rather spiritual forces are involved through and through. And this is not actually, in fact, different to the way in which the Romans thought of their world. Caesar was, for example, Jupiter's agent on Earth, and the gods, to varying extents, had influence over the shape and flow of history. Apocalyptic texts will make uses of visions, symbolism, especially numbers and colours. Numbers within the ancient world more broadly as well are often symbolic, and within Judaism in particular, there are certain numbers that have resonance within the broader biblical tradition. Think of, for example, the 12 tribes of Israel, or 40, number of times 40 as a period of time, whether it's 40 days or 40 years wandering in the wilderness, or what have you. So these numbers recur time and again. They have this kind of symbolic value. 7 is often understood to point to kind of completeness or fullness. Colours also have significance in a way that our own culture and all cultures interpret certain colours to mean certain things. You know, purple is the colour of royalty, or what have you.
Certain colours when you're in the church, you know, depending on the time of year.
Right, liturgical colours as well, highly symbolic. Or wearing red on the vestments will be red on, you know, martyr days or Pentecost, white at Easter. Yeah, so this is something that the tradition itself has picked up as well, and often parable. Animal forms are used to designate persons, so we have these references to beasts, so on and so forth, which we'll unpack a bit later. But they, in fact, quite often designate specific persons, historical figures. And natural phenomena might be used to pictorialize events, stars and lakes and burning fires and so on and so forth. So colourful imagery, and yeah, there is a sense in which, why don't you just tell us what you think? You know, why don't you just, no, that's not the point. Is that it's a difficult book to interpret, especially one that we're not from that particular cultural context. The root idea within Apocalyptic, as I mentioned, is this dualism of the two ages. This age marked by wickedness, persecution for the saints of God, contrasted with the age to come. And at this age will be the installation of a new kingdom ruled by God, and in the book of Revelation as co-regent Jesus for a millennium. And we're going to talk a bit about the violent imagery, but I think that it is important to keep in mind that, yeah, there is this message of consolation and hope. So I guess a word that some of you may be familiar with this word, theodicy, Theodicy, which refers to the study of or an explanation of the reason for evil in the world. If God is all-powerful and God is all-loving, why does evil exist in the world? And many biblical books deal with these sorts of issues, whether in abstract or concrete ways. I think the book of Job is a brilliant example of wrestling with this problem. And it's one that the theological tradition more broadly and widely has had a lot to say about. And Apocalyptic itself is one sort of example or way of explaining it, and it's that you've got to take a longer view of history. This is ultimately a reflection of cosmic battles between the forces of good and the forces of evil. It's perhaps an explanation, a theodicy that might not be as convincing to people today as it might have been in the first century. I don't know, but again, I think the perspective from which we read and encounter the text may play a role in this. If we're reading the text as persecuted, minority Christian sect on the margins of the empire in the late first century experiencing real violence, you might have a different view on this. So the seer, John expresses assurance that all is safe in God's hands, ultimately, in spite of the present time of distress. And there is a sense in which, yeah, history is unfolding towards a predetermined eventuality. The answer to this question of the problem of evil, why are things so bad now, is that, well, holding strong and firm to the belief that God is all-powerful, ultimately things will all be made right in the New World Order.
In the historical Jewish context, the Jews believed that demons were actual real beings, in the same way that evil was manifested into some sort of reality. It wasn't just the events, because you've got Jesus driving out demons, and I assume that would have fitted into the historical context of where Jews believe.
I mean, yeah, and I think our issue often is looking at these things with this modern Western distinction between the natural and the supernatural. That's a really interesting example of Jesus casting out demons, because obviously one of the famous ones is where he asks the demon for its name, and he says Legion, which is a really obvious Roman reference to the Roman military, and in a society under occupation by the Romans, like that kind of reference could not be misunderstood. That's exactly what you would hear. You think, okay, that's, you know, that is calling this military occupation by Rome demonic, and I think sincerely believed as well. You know? So yeah, it's sort of a failing on our part to be able to reconcile those things. Yeah, and I think that view that kind of the spiritual is just happening somewhere else, not in the realm that we inhabit, is not the view of ancient peoples generally, or first century Jews in particular. Religion was, or what we would call religion, was everywhere, influencing and informing everything that was part of the worldview. So taken here, one of many texts I could have taken, but I think this one kind of sums up this idea of the replacement of one kingdom with another quite succinctly. This is in Revelation chapter 11, verse 15, where the seventh angel, and angel in Greek literally means messenger. So angels, through biblical literature, through the tradition, we've developed a kind of understanding of angels and so on. But within the biblical literature, they tend to perform the roles of being messengers, primarily God's messengers. Then the seventh angel blew his trumpet. This is very warlike imagery, actually, which is why I've got that image of the Roman soldier blowing his trumpet. And there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdom of the world," that is the kingdom of Rome, the empire of Rome, "has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever." So this grand proclamation, this grand announcement, following the blowing of a trumpet, and this voice emanating down. Remember that I might have mentioned before that the word kingdom is the same word that gets translated as empire. So when talking about the Roman Empire, it's the word used as basileia, which gets translated kingdom here. So there is a very strong theopolitical view coming through here of the transition from the current world order ruled by the rulers of this world to the kingdom of God, ruled by the Lord God and his Messiah. Okay, and I'll go through one more slide and then we can have a break. So in kind of no uncertain, no ambiguity about it, Revelation pronounces God's condemnation of Rome and its empire. And the point that I'm making, and I know I'm repeating myself infinitely here, but it is an important point to make, is that this is in contrast, quite stark contrast to Acts. Acts skirted around the issues, with the book of Revelation, there's no ambiguity about it at all. And it also functions as this kind of theopolitical fantasy of overcoming great oppression. There is to be no compromise at all with Rome. And one of the things that comes through in other texts of the New Testament, and we'll see this, I think, next week when we look at the pastoral epistles, is that as the Christian tradition developed, accommodation to Rome became necessary. It became necessary for the survival of the movement and its institutionalization as a religion. This is not a view that would be shared by the author of Revelation. It's not a case of, rendering to Caesar what Caesar's and so on. It is complete allegiance to Christ and God, Jewish God, even in a hostile environment. Now, the word faith itself is one that I think is often not misunderstood, but understood quite reductively in the modern world. Again, this has to do with our the distinction we operate with between the natural and the supernatural. And faith is often reductivistically seen as believing things, particularly believing in the unseen or supernatural or something like that. Well, such a view wouldn't make much sense to someone in the first century because everybody believed in gods, generally speaking. That wasn't really a question. So when the New Testament is talking about faith, it's talking about faith in something or faith in someone. It's about allegiance to a particular God, or more broadly perhaps set of values, or other relationships. And the word again had a much broader so-called secular meaning, or it wasn't just concerning religious relationships. So the emperor had faith for his citizens, and they needed to have faith in him, not simply as a divine figure or semi-divine figure, but an allegiance to his political power and to the power of Rome. Roman soldiers themselves, the relationship between Roman centurions and soldiers under them and so on, they would often use this language of faith, of faithfulness, to talk about that. And I find that quite interesting in terms of that encounter that Jesus has with the centurion and his servant. And Jesus says of the centurion, nowhere in all of Israel have I found faith as I've seen here. And again, that we have to take a sort of wider view of faith. He's talking about the faithfulness, the investment in the relationship that he has for, and the concern that he's showing for his servant, which within a hierarchical society, is what is being applauded there by Jesus, I think. And so anyway, broad view of faith, faith meaning allegiance. And so whenever the author of Revelation is talking about unfaithfulness and so on, he understands that actually as treason, treason against the Jewish God. Any compromise to Rome is regarded as treasonous. So in one of the communities that he writes to, he addresses his letter to, he makes this little reference to the Nicolaitans. And this is a group of Christians that we know absolutely nothing about other than the reference here. But it seems that they were compromisers. So it's no surprise that there were different Christian groups at the time, because we've already seen the Book of Acts had a different view, that have different stances towards how much compromise was okay, was acceptable. So in 2 verse 6, so this is where he's addressing the angel of the church in Ephesus, 2:1, and from 2:6. Yet this is to your credit. You hate the work of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. And then in verses 13 to 15, I know where you are living, where Satan's throne is. Now, Satan here would be a veiled reference to, again, a real person, probably someone, a ruler particularly high up in the scheme of things as a throne. Yet you are holding fast to my name, and you did not deny your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you, where Satan lives. But I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the people of Israel, so that they would eat food sacrificed to idols and practice fornication. So you also have some who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. So compromise to Rome is understood as idolatry. And these are well-worn metaphors in the Old Testament of the worship of other gods as being kind of adulterous, unfaithful, and so on and so forth. And next week, when we come to look at the pastoral epistles, but there are other texts as well, like 1 Peter. In fact, 1 Peter is an interesting text to look at, because I think that verse there is, if I'm remembering correctly, is pretty much the antithesis of what we've been exploring here. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 to 14. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme or the governors, as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing right, you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. So, a pretty strong command to obey the authority of the emperor. And Romans 13 actually is another interesting example of this quite explicit view of Romans 13 begins, let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. I don't think the author of the book of Revelation would necessarily agree with these particular views that we find elsewhere. Some of the cities mentioned in the beginning of the book of Revelation, historically speaking, some of these cities were known to have erected temples or altars to various Roman Caesars. So when the author refers to, you're doing as the Nicolaitans do or something like that, there is a sense in which they're participating in the temple cult of another god, quite possibly the divine powers or forces behind Rome. And around the empire as well, it wasn't just the existence of temples, there were various festivals and civic events that I think in some cases would have been quite difficult to get out of, depending on your situation and station within a particular area. But this would have proved, made life difficult. And the author of John is coming from a very separatist, anti the world as it is kind of perspective. And I think that's a nice place to stop for a coffee break.
Strong cup of coffee.
A strong cup of coffee. We'll resume in about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's try and go through in sequence if we can from the beginning of chapter 12. And what were some of the main images you could find identified?
There's the great red dragon, 7 heads and 7 crowns.
Yep, 10 horns.
Yeah.
So the great red dragon seems to be a fairly major character through this passage in heaven.
Beasts, not
Beasts.
beasts.
Now we've missed one that I think is quite
Sun, moon,
important.
and stars.
The woman. Yes. So it starts with a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet,
And stars
and on a head
around.
of crown of 12 stars. Now,
Was it 12?
and pregnant.
Hmm.
Who do we think this
Mary.
woman is?
Mary.
They're all wrong. But I can see why you think
Jerusalem.
the clue might be with the 12.
What's
12 tribes.
12 tribes
Yeah.
of Israel.
So this woman seems to be symbolizing Israel and the Messianic community, the hopes of the Messiah more broadly, so not Mary specifically. But I can see how you make that connection. But I think the broader kind of clues about particularly the 12 stars is a crucial detail that suggests, yeah, this is, and also further on when the woman flees into the wilderness, like something that Israel does.
Yeah.
Israel,
Yes.
finds God, spends time or whatever in the wilderness. So
And tempted by the serpent there.
yeah,
Yeah.
so all these are things going through from Israelite mythology and tradition and so on to make that identification. Okay, we had beasts. There's more than one beast, isn't there?
There's eagles, there's serpents, there's lambs.
The blood of the lamb overcame the dragon.
Mm.
So it's like a cleansing thing, yeah.
The lambs.
Right?
So the lamb is imagery that is used of Jesus elsewhere in the New Testament as well, isn't it? So you've got particularly in John, I am the Lamb of God. And obviously, yeah, to refer to the blood of the lamb is referring to, it's the same imagery that John uses to refer to the sacrifice of Christ. Of course, a lamb would be, an animal that would be sacrificed in such a way. But it is a metaphor we know from elsewhere of Jesus. So if Jesus, if the lamb conquers the dragon, so to speak, what's the dragon?
Rome.
I would suggest that it's the spiritual forces or the demonic forces that power Rome, that are behind Rome. I think some of the details are critical here. That this portal appeared in heaven, a great red dragon, 7 heads, 10 horns, and so on.
I thought it was the things that they worshipped, like the gods they worship, that they give them the strength to.
Yeah, so the spiritual forces, the spiritual elements that are part of or lay behind Roman imperial theology and belief and so on. Another metaphor I don't think is used in this section refers to, is used to refer to Rome itself as a political entity. It's the imagery of Babylon. And if you're familiar with the Old Testament, that image itself is a powerful one. It's this place, Babylon is this foreign empire where the Babylonians conquered Israel and sent off a portion of the population to the exile of Babylon and so on. And, this is something that was very influential on the formation of a number of, particularly the prophetic texts in the Old Testament. So again, that's kind of the symbolism of Babylon as an evil empire, trying to impose its will and stop Israel from worshipping its God. would be, again, a metaphor that would be, you know, if you read it in the 1st century, Babylon, evil empire, okay, yeah, right, because that's the only thing that would have made sense in that context. Yeah, there's the sense that, or there's this description of the red dragon in heaven sweeping its tail and 1/3 of the stars falling to earth. And so we have, again, this idea that these great battles in heaven and of heavenly forces are themselves manifesting in various ways on earth as tangible political forces.
And there was Michael and the angels fighting the
Fighting
dragon.
on one side versus the other. And but when it kind of comes, you know, these forces rain down, these spirit forces rain down on the earth. Actually, I should mention that you know, they're not the ancients here aren't sort of imagining a kind of Copernican universe as such. The heavens are literally the dwelling places of the gods, in perhaps a much more tangible and real sense than we might think. We've kind of evacuated God to beyond the universe because we've kind of made it to space, right? But and a good example of that kind of understanding comes through in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15. He's talking about the resurrected body, and he compares it to heavenly bodies, by which he means the stars and the celestial entities in the skies, which the ancients thought was made out of a different kind of matter. They were made out of matter, but it wasn't the kind of the matter that we have on earth. It's a spiritual, perfected matter, and for Paul, that's what the resurrected body of Jesus was like. It was bodily, but it was what he called actually a spiritual body, a heavenly body.
In this pamphlet here, I noticed there's a picture of coin, the divine Caesar, who is sitting on top of a remarkably accurate image of the globe, with what might be the tropical Cancer and Capricorn and a meridian. So their cosmology wasn't completely up the creek.
No, possibly not.
They got that right.
Unless it's a disc and not a sphere.
So it's definitely a sphere, or he couldn't be
Yes,
sitting on it.
Interesting.
And the parallels to the meridians are correctly drawn. It's definitely a sphere.
Yeah, interesting. So back to the beasts. Any ideas?
Why two?
I think it's the road. I thought it was Rome.
Well, if Babylon's Rome,
So I got that
the
one.
dragon is the spiritual forces behind Rome. The beasts emerge. So the beasts are manifestations of Caesars. Remember, there wasn't just one.
Yeah.
I think that the first Caesar is Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. And it talks about, you know, his 10 horns and 7 heads and so on. These perhaps symbols of his power. And on his heads were blasphemous names. Well, we saw, for example, those coins where Augustus was propagated as Son of God. And there were many other kind of titles like that that mix the political with the religious, and, you know, within this context could be identified as blasphemous from the perspective of this Jewish author.
So what's the eagle?
Well, the eagle is a known symbol of the empire as well, isn't it? It's on the one that churches have appropriated, interestingly.
Yes.
As well. Yeah.
But it's not identify with a particular Caesar,
No, I'm not sure about that. It
it's
might,
just,
yeah, I don't know.
just something bad.
The symbolism in beast 2 breathes life into beast 1.
Right, yeah.
And so it potentially has something to do with emperor worship being fostered, I think, by beast 2 after beast 1 has disappeared.
And various emperors, well, the emperors to varying degrees mandated emperor worship, and some of them, insisted on this divine cult of emperor worship, and others were had more tolerant reigns. So, just before we get to that, just note that 13 verse 3, in amazement, the whole earth followed the beast. They worshipped the dragon, who had given authority to the beast. So there is the sense of, and further down in verse 7, it was given authority over every tribe and people and language and nation, and all the inhabitants of the earth will worship it. To put it in context, the Roman Empire at this time was the biggest political entity and religious entity the world had ever seen to that point. And when Acts talks about the ends of the earth, it means the ends of the Roman Empire. I think a similar sense is coming through here, that the whole earth worships this beast. I mean, this is an incredibly huge political power that dominates society over every nation, and so on.
So is the dragon then part of the cosmic role that supports the beasts?
Part of that, I think that would be my interpretation, that the red dragon is this, is the spiritual forces, demonic forces that give power to these beasts.
It says it
Why
was
is the red
the
dragon the
same.
symbol of Wales?
Yeah, well, that's interesting as well, isn't it?
Bloody Welsh.
Now, at verse 11 we have this another Caesar. Now, this one we in fact can identify relatively easily. It won't seem easy to many of us here, but again, this is one of those things that if you were a Jewish reader in the first century, you'd be able to decode this quite easily. Towards the end of chapter 13, we have that very famous description of the number of the beast. 666. And interestingly, this is one of those things where that number has been decoded to supposedly refer to anyone from the Pope to Vladimir Putin to Donald Trump to whoever, right? Most scholars would say that this number represents, within Jewish numerology of the time, the Emperor Nero's name. I can't go through it all. It's sort of complicated without knowing languages, but if Kaiser Caesar Neron is spelled in Hebrew, and then each Hebrew letter is designated a number, and then you add those numbers up, it equals 666. The interesting thing is that this works for an alternative reading of this manuscript. So remember when we looked at Mark, how the different we have disagreements between manuscripts. This is in fact one of the places where we have a disagreement. And if you look in your Bible, most translations should at the end of verse 18 have a little footnote, and it will have other ancient authorities, that's other manuscripts or whatever, reads 616. So is the number of the beast 666 or is it 616? Well, we have disagreement among the manuscripts. but it works either way for Nero. The slight variation is that for 666 it's Neron, and for 616 it's Nero. But that in itself kind of confirms that, you know, the variant readings can both point to this figure, and it's one that would have been comprehensible to a Jewish reader in that historical period and so on. Then that makes sense. Why might that name be being evoked? Well, of course, to many of us, Nero's name will be infamous as that Roman emperor who was a little bit crazy in the 60s and went about seriously persecuting Christians.
Yeah.
In fact, one tradition blames the Great Fire of Rome, Nero blaming the Great Fire of Rome on the Christians for starting it and then using that as a pretext for engaging in persecution. The historicity of that is debated, but you know that tradition nonetheless exists. The text here suggests that the beast that is of concern to the present community who's reading this letter is this particular second beast here, come back from the dead. So it's actually Nero come back from the dead. I removed the slide, I should put it back in for next time, but there was a strong tradition of the Emperor Domitian in the 90s, who himself was a strong advocate for mandating, honoring him as my Lord and my God throughout the empire. And there is a view that he was, among Christians, that he was Nero reincarnated.
Okay.
So I know that's a bit of a kind of long route to get there, and there is disagreement within scholarship about this, that maybe it actually is just referring to Nero and that Revelation might have been written earlier or something like that. But what I'm presenting is the dominant view. I've got a slide here just with many of the things I mentioned, but the point I want to move on to is towards the bottom of the slide, where another metaphor comes out in this text, one that I think is really problematic, particularly today, where we are a lot more sensitive to issues of gender, and in its condemnation of Rome is denigrated, identified and denigrated as great whore, full of blasphemous names, and so on and so forth. And it's somewhat interesting that the author of Revelation uses that imagery, because Rome itself was personified as a woman, as were many of the nations. So you'll see here on this relief, that there is an image of Emperor Domitian. Now, that's not his face. His face was recast, and that's why it sort of looks a bit weird. We can't see it, but up close it looks a bit weird. It was recast as his successor, Nerva. So Domitian had a terrible reign and was kind of expunged from history soon after the fact, when he was deposed and assassinated actually in 96. But you see here, the imagery here is very interesting, because you've got the goddess Roma standing behind him in military garb,
She looks remarkably like Britannia.
holding him up, you know, supporting him up. And the female figure on the left is Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. And I guess my sense is that, like, of showing this is to get this broader context where these images and these ideas were gendered, and I think that the author of Revelation is engaging in kind of gendered stereotypes in order to make his point. A point that I think is kind of, you know, we can kind of get it. He's denouncing the empire, but he's kind of not doing it in a very nice way. He's turning this woman of strength and vigor and power and might into a whore. We see here another coin, and on the right-hand side is the goddess Roma sitting on the 7 mountains, the 7 hills of Rome, famously. You know, and so this again was an image that was known throughout the empire, and Revelation itself in 17:9 makes reference to identifies this whore, this great whore, as the one who is seated on the 7 hills, so that it's unambiguously Rome. Roma in Greek, you know, itself literally means strength. So it's really interesting to think about, you know, the whole mythology and theology of Rome and Rome's empire going around conquering and so on, and founded on this idea of strength and conquest and what have you. So that's why she's often adorned in this military gear, sort of gender bending in her own way, according to traditional stereotypes, as this sort of Amazonian style warrior woman. So remember, though, back to earlier, and much earlier in the unit, in this class, I think the first week I showed this image of the Emperor Claudius, another Roman emperor, who, you know, this relief is kind of commemorating his conquest of Britannia, personified as a woman, and it's a chilling image of gender violence. But again, you know, a defeated, subjugated nation, and these political ideas understood using gendered imagery and violent imagery. Well, this was a series of a number of reliefs of this kind. I think the one that I show, and the reason why I show that one is because it's the most vivid. The others aren't so much, but they're still kind of disturbing when viewed in context. So here we have the Emperor Nero towering over the female personification of Armenia, and here we have another world-conquering Claudic emperor with a battle trophy, holding him by his hair or whatever, I don't know, his head, and then what looks to be a bound, weeping barbarian prisoner. So, you know, there's this. This was Rome's own propaganda. The imagery of violently conquering the nations and this being understood in gendered ways was prevalent. It was Rome's own understanding of what it was doing and how it propagated its own agenda. Now, the problem occurs for us, I think, in that the book of Revelation doesn't do away with violence or gendered violence. It mimics it. It recasts Jesus as you know, a divine agent of the Jewish God, as the emperor, as the rightful ruler of the world, who within the book of Revelation violently conquers Rome, who is personified as a whore. And just to sort of make that point, that's why I have that image, which I realize is controversial and what have you, but you know, it's something that we have to deal with, because the violence within the book of Revelation is actually off the charts, and I think that it kind of can't be swept under the rug. In one sense, the book of Revelation is employing a traditional view of the traditional understanding of the Davidic Messiah as liberator. Remember when we looked at the book of, when we looked at the Gospel of Mark, how, and also this comes through in Paul and some other texts, that the idea of a crucified Messiah, of a conquered Messiah, was an anathema. You know, that goes against traditional understandings. Well, that view was held hand in hand with, well, yes, but Jesus is coming back, at which point he will violently conquer and take control of the world. And so there is something quite traditional about this view. This Davidic Messiah, Jesus, will conquer their foreign oppressors, the Jewish people's foreign oppressors. So a couple of verses there, Revelation 17:4 in particular. The Lamb, as Jesus, will conquer them, for he is the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, the rightful ruler of the earth. But again, problematically, the Messianic community, those anticipating Jesus' return, and this comes through particularly in the opening chapters with the letters, with the mention of the 7 churches to which the text is addressed, invites the Messianic community to conquer with Jesus. And are offered, you know, eternal reward for participating in that divine war, what's seen as a divine war. To the one who conquers, I will give a place with me on my throne, just as I myself conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. And again, this quite violent imagery comes through. I think a point that's worth making here is that violence is not, it's not unusual for there to be this sort of violence within the biblical text. And it's a good reminder to us that sometimes you hear the view of oh, you know, the God in the Old Testament was violent and what have you, but Jesus preached love, and the New Testament is all about love and kindness and holding hands and so on. Well, not all of it. And the Jesus in the book of Revelation is this violent conqueror who, in fighting against Roman imperialism, mimics Roman imperialism. You know, again, interestingly, you know, the Quran came up before, and again, sometimes those comparisons are made, you know, oh, Jesus preached peace, but Islam is a religion of the sword, or what have you. I think the point I'm trying to stress is that we ourselves have some ugly remnants within our own tradition. And so a number of critics have labeled Revelation a text of terror. It's really a case of what are we meant to do with this? How are we going to faithfully interpret it in a way that doesn't ignore the ugly parts, but that we can still hold true to it as scripture and so on. Well, sorry, any comments or questions before I come on?
they were writing for people who were basically terrorised by Rome. Or by everybody, actually. I mean, there was little peace.
And I think that's I don't think it excuses violence, but at that perspective, as I've kind of indicated already, it's really important to have that this is a marginalized, oppressed community, and extreme violence seems to be the only language that they know how to describe what needs to happen to make things right. And it's a perspective that I think is very difficult for us to relate to. But the caution here is that you know, in a society where, say, Christianity is the or a dominant player in society, different kind of message comes through. And you know, in terms of the broader narrative of this unit, one of the things that actually does happen is that Jesus does become the empire, or you know, Christianity does become melded with the Roman Empire. So a conquering of sort does happen. Not quite in the way that the Book of Revelation envisages, but it does sort of happen.
Then evil is aggressive or cruel, and so we can't avoid dealing with the terror of the evil with us.
Yeah, I guess another way of thinking about it might be that, at least from the perspective of the author and their community and so on, it would be impossible to imagine peace without violence first, and without I don't know. I think of Lenin, the architect of the Russian Revolution, right? And one of the famous things that he said is that, you know, there will be no revolution. There will be no revolution without violence, because as soon as you try to take power from the state, it will fight back. So you're going to have to fight it violently. You can't sort of do it peacefully, because you're talking about toppling an empire or a state, what have you. So. Okay, so I've got on this slide, just as we wrap up, I've got two more slides, this one and the next. And this is various things we've discussed, but that Revelation is presenting this view because of its marginal position in terms of the empire, and it's pronouncing serious judgment on it. But from the perspective of the author, there are several things which are wrong with the empire, the Roman Empire, and these seem to be the major ones. There's political oppression, and I've got references here, so in your own time you might want to look some of these up and see the imagery and the language that it uses to refer to these sorts of aspects. There's also economic exploitation. This is quite an interesting passage in verse 18, where it talks about, so this is within the overall narrative of Revelation. This is describing once Rome has been, delegitimized, Jesus has conquered Rome and so on. And then you have, all the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore, cargo of gold, silver, jewels, and bills. It's talking about this big economic system that the empire supported, with their roads and their tributes to Rome and all that kind of stuff. And I think the biggest issue that the author has with the empire is its religious legitimation. The fact that Rome itself is not just seen as this political entity, but this blasphemous false idol that stands in opposition to the Jewish God. And from a perspective of monotheism, Jewish monotheism, worship of any other God before the Jewish God is, well, against the first commandment, is idolatry. So there is to be no compromise. The message of hope that comes out towards the end is that God in Christ conquers Rome and establishes this divine kingdom on earth. It's not some kind of escapist heaven to which people will be delivered after they die. It is that the world will be recreated and God's kingdom will come to earth as it is in heaven. And so we get these vivid pictures of this recreated earth and the New Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem as the kind of spiritual capital of God's holy city, of a new empire, the empire of God and such. But in the interim, there will be strife, persecution, warfare, and so on. So repeated messages of having patience, remaining allegiant, and so on. Yeah, to repeat myself, there is no compromise. There is no judgment will come not only on Rome, but also on anybody who collaborates with Rome. And it's interesting to think about that in terms of how the author of Revelation, would have viewed some of the other authors of the New Testament, such as the author of the Book of Acts. Would he have excluded them from being, Christians or what have you? It's interesting to think about. We can't fully explore the answers to those questions, but there's a perspective that comes through here that is not necessarily in alignment with some of those other texts. Any final questions or comments?
There's a reference in the chapters you asked us to look through.
Mm.
No one can buy or sell without this mark. What's the significance of that?
So that's in the reference in the text we're looking at, in reference to the number of the beast, isn't it?
In 1380.
I mean, my sense, and I don't know if the reading said something else or develop this, but my understanding of that is that the emperor ultimately controls all commerce, right? That the coins have his image on them, so that I don't. Yeah, do the readings develop it or no?
And just jotted down that phrase.
Yeah.
Maybe don't about that in
What's that?
I'm just trying to. I think something was mentioned about that when we did right at the very beginning. We were talking about the coins, weren't you? What they represented.
Yeah.
They invented new ones according to the victory they just had.
Right. Yeah. So the Judea captor coins and.
Interesting, because we still even we do that, don't we?
Yeah. The Queen's Queen's head. Yeah. No. Yeah. And, of course, we're sort of moving towards a cashless society, though, so there'll be less and less of that.
Yeah.
Now it's just the mark of the beast is no longer a coin, but your plastic card.
Yes. Or no, even the phone.
Flags of
Or your
life.
phone, yeah. All right, well, that's a good place to wrap up. So thanks very much. See you next week.
Thank you very much. Always good.